In Section 5 of Module 3, we're going to talk about the conversion of demand signals into supply activities, bearing in mind that in this module, we're looking at an importer of finished goods who sells those goods through an omni-channel distribution model. As we know, a primary objective of global supply chain management is the coupling of demand signals with supply activities. What we also know is that by definition, when we outsource manufacturing, we're decoupling the buy side from the sell side of the supply chain. It is our job as the importer of finished goods to overcompensate for that decoupling and find ways to bring everybody back together, which in essence becomes an exercise in dynamic inventory management. That just means, as we've seen previously, managing inventory as it is physically moving across global supply chains. In a global business model, the key to success lies in the accuracy of information and the speed with which it is disseminated to relevant supply chain partners. We talked about this in the previous section when we spoke of consuming the forecast. Take a forecast, compare it to actual demand during a period, and make adjustments in the supply chain. How accurate is that information, and how quickly can we do that in our outsourced manufacturing model? For an importer making purchases of finished goods from overseas suppliers, there are several functional areas involved in this, some internal to the company, some external to supply chain partners. A couple of things to think about here. First, are we dealing with a build-to-order model or a build-to-stock purchasing model? That is to say, do our overseas vendors, do they only manufacture when we place an order on them? Or do they have stock laying around to just fill an order when we place it? That is a big difference from a timing perspective. As we have discussed and will continue to talk about, the predominant model when dealing with overseas manufacturers as a U.S. importer is built to order. They're not going to make anything until we place an order on them, and as we'll see in a bit, actually make a down payment. Second sub-bullet, the method for converting demand signals into purchase orders, going from our forecast, taking into consideration actual demand, and how do we convert forecasted and actual demand into the purchase orders that have to be placed on these overseas manufacturers. And then, because we are outsourcing our manufacturing, what is the internal management of MRP functions? Which essentially is the planning of the acquisition of raw materials that our vendors are going to have to engage in based on the purchase orders we place on them. Some other functional areas involved, both internal and external. What is the method for communicating these purchase orders to overseas vendors? Do we as the importer place orders via email, using an Excel spreadsheet attachment? That goes on a lot, even in the 21st century. Do we use a cloud-based purchase order management system that allows us to send POs electronically to our vendors? What's the method? It has to be defined ahead of time. Second sub-bullet, the alignment of demand-based purchasing with vendor production capacity. That just means that we as the buyer, as the importer, are placing POs on overseas vendors based on our demand signals, but we just can't assume that they have the production capacity, they being the overseas manufacturer, to accommodate our needs. Another key point here is the minimum order quantities that are higher than actual product demand. A real-world consideration. We might only need, based on demand signals, 500 units of a product in a month. However, the vendor overseas says you have to buy a minimum of 1,000. That's an MOQ, a minimum order quantity. How do we identify and deal with those types of situations? In this slide, we're using a little bit of color coding to identify who does what between the importer of finished goods in the United States and the overseas manufacturers, the overseas suppliers. Green is internal, the actual importer in the U.S., and red is external, the vendors that are making the goods on our behalf as the importer. That's what we're looking at here. So let's start with green. What are the internal responsibilities of the importer in the United States? Number one, we said this a bunch of times. Demand management. We have to come up with a forecast. We have to be able to deal with actual customer orders and consume the forecast. That is on us as the importer. Sourcing. As we'll see in Module 4, which deals exclusively with sourcing, we as the U.S. company, we're the ones that have to go out and identify the vendors that we can work with. That is on us entirely. Risk management as well. Product testing, product quality, dealing with samples, all the things that go on long before goods move are part of risk management, mitigating the risk associated with importing merchandise. The purchasing function, certainly on us as the importer, and purchasing is definitely different from sourcing. Sourcing is that strategic activity of identifying countries and companies within those countries to buy from. Purchasing is the day-to-day placing and management and expediting of actual purchase orders. That's on us. As is inbound shipping and U.S. Customs compliance, we as the importer of record are solely responsible to U.S. Customs and Border Protection for compliance. And the accounting piece, you might say to yourself, well, this is a little disjointed, but how does accounting have anything to do with importing? Well, of course, we have to pay for the merchandise that we're importing. We have to put ourselves in a position to make sure that we get what we paid for, that the quality is there, that there's no rework required. So accounting is essential to supply chain management and definitely to importing. So all of these green activities are on the importer in the United States. Moving along to the responsibilities of the external partner, the actual manufacturer overseas, we can see a listing of manufacturing planning and control functions. The vendor overseas is responsible for these activities. How do we help them to meet these responsibilities is a big part of supply chain management for an importer of finished goods. MRP, as we've said, material requirements planning is about planning for the acquisition of raw materials that goes into manufacturing. How are our vendors overseas going to know what type of raw materials and in what quantities they're going to need if we're not working with them, giving them visibility into forecasts, placing actual POs, making adjustments quickly? MRP is on the vendor. We have to facilitate that activity. Same goes for master production scheduling. If we're not in a position as the U.S. importer to know when our product is going to get made, bearing in mind that overseas vendors have other customers too, that's a big problem from a cumulative lead time perspective. It's closely related to capacity planning, meaning how many production lines does our vendor overseas have? What capacity do they have for production? And can they meet the delivery dates in the quantities that we're ordering? Outbound shipping, at least delivery to a port of export, for sure, overseas, is the responsibility of the seller. And they have accounting functions too, because they have to send us accurate invoices for the goods that we're buying so we can pay them. Everybody has accounting responsibilities. A little bit of a view into converting demand signals into supply activities in that outsourced omni-channel environment. Continuing with a little bit of our color coding, a visual representation of what we've been talking about. The title is Aligning Importer and Supplier Functions. The importer in the United States and the overseas manufacturer, the supplier of the finished goods that are being imported into the U.S. On the left-hand side in green, the U.S. importer. On the right-hand side in red, our overseas supplier. Very consistent with what we just saw in prose form. Starting with forecasted and actual demand, which incorporates consuming the forecast. All of the strategic work that went into sourcing, what countries will we buy from, what companies will we work with, what are the negotiations, etc. Transitioning into that operational purchase order management element, which is conducted by the purchasing department. And then inbound shipping, inbound logistics, ocean freight, air freight, customs work in the U.S., etc. The overseas supplier. An interesting perspective here, starting out with order management. Well, didn't we say that it's we as the importer that have to deal with orders? Well, sure, of course we do. That's part of consuming the forecast. But if you think about it, the vendor is doing the same thing. They're creating a forecast for what they think they're going to produce and sell. They want to consume their forecast with actual orders. That's what we mean here. These are companies essentially doing the same thing, but in different places from different perspectives. Moving along to the right, yes, MRP, Material Requirements Planning. The vendor has to plan for the acquisition in both quantity and timing of raw materials. Master production scheduling, as we spoke of, which incorporates capacity planning, and then the outbound shipping component. How do we bring these together in a form that integrates and synchronizes all of these functional activities, which are clearly divided between the importer and the overseas supplier? That's the trick to supply chain management. Let's bring a new supply chain perspective in here, what's referred to as the bullwhip effect. We haven't talked about it too much. It's really important, especially in an outsourced manufacturing environment where demand signals can become distorted as they travel across the supply chain in and out of the hands of many supply chain partners. The bullwhip effect is a supply chain phenomenon whereby demand signals become increasingly distorted as they make their way up the supply chain to suppliers and manufacturers. Ultimately, the impact of the bullwhip effect is the misalignment of actual demand with supply, a scenario that inevitably ends with excess inventory. It's an exaggeration of demand as information passes from hand to hand, from company to company. Originally introduced in 1961 by Jay Forrester in his book Industrial Dynamics, the bullwhip effect was further refined for application to supply chain management by Dr. Hao Li of Stanford University in the 1990s. In an outsourced sourcing environment where demand signals must be shared with multiple third parties, the potential for distorted communications and bloated inventories is exceedingly high. An example of the bullwhip effect can be seen when a company is overstocked on a certain product and looks to clear out inventory with a special sales price. If that promotion works, demand management professionals may misinterpret the demand signal and actually forecast for higher sales in the future. The whole idea was to get rid of this stuff by lowering the price. Demand management people misinterpret that information, distort that information, and take it as a demand signal that it really isn't. That is an example of the bullwhip effect. There are others, but the whole idea of the bullwhip effect is that a demand signal is received, and that as it makes its way up the supply chain, the information becomes distorted, becomes exaggerated, usually in the form of more inventory, not less. It's an exaggeration of information. To close out this supply chain perspective, and something we'll talk about shortly in our closing section, a well-defined sales and operations planning program can help to avoid this type of bullwhip effect. Let's look at the bullwhip effect visually. As you can see, the silhouetted figure essentially is holding a bullwhip in his hands. The demand signal, the original demand signal, is closest to that person's hand. But as information travels up the supply chain, starting out with, we need 100 units of a particular item, for a number of different reasons, as information travels across the supply chain, it becomes exaggerated. If you think about it, salespeople by definition have a tendency to exaggerate demand, and it just becomes amplified as it travels through the organization. And by the time it becomes an actual purchase order, in the case of buying finished goods from an overseas vendor, you get what you see at the left-hand side, a distorted representation, an exaggeration of demand. And that's the demand that gets shared with vendors, and that's what creates excess inventory. As we said, sales and operations planning helps to diminish the impact of the bullwhip effect. Let's finish here, and upon our return, we'll talk about outsourced production and omnichannel distribution, build-to-order models, the predominant model in importing today. We'll see you soon.